As I was saying, a shockingly well-disciplined crowd. I won't actually drop the gavel until officially 10 o'clock because members have until 10 o'clock to get here to get in line. And if I drop the gavel early, I'm sure a few of them would the people who are here are like, do it, do it. But I don't want people throwing things at me to start the hearing. So we're just going to wait about a minute and a half here and then we'll get started. All right, and we will call the meeting to order. Thank you all for being here. This morning we have testimony from the Northern Command and the Southern Command, and it is a very topical time to have both of them in. There's a lot going on in both areas. We will have 4 witnesses with opening testimony. We have General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who is the commander of the U.S. Northern Command, Admiral Craig Fowler, who is the commander of U.S. Southern Command, the Honorable Catherine Wheelbarger, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and the Honorable Kenneth Rapuano, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security. And as I was mentioning when I met with these 2 gentlemen earlier, we do not have to say this will probably be your last time before you testify before us. We've had a lot of turnover and a lot of folks coming before us for the last time. But both of you, I think, as far as we know, going to be here for a little while. Before we begin, I do want to start on a sad note. Many of you, some of us up here, served with Ellen Tauscher, who is a member of the Armed Services Committee for a little over 12 years. She passed away this week, very sadly. I came into Congress actually in 1996 with Ellen, served in this committee with her for her whole time before she moved over to the Obama administration to engage in arms-controlled discussions with the Russians. Ellen was a terrific person and a great member of this committee. She will be missed by many, and I just want to express my condolences and sympathies for her family and friends, and just mention what a great pleasure it was serving with her, and appreciate her service to our country and to her district. Mac, did you want to say anything?
Thank you, sir. I would just add that I think Ellen reflects the best of the bipartisan traditions of this committee. She worked on both sides of the aisle, especially on nuclear arms control issues, a wonderful, warm, caring person, and I think we're all going to miss her, but also continue to benefit from the example she set for both of us, and I appreciate the opportunity to say that.
Thank you. And with that, as I mentioned, we are having the testimony from the Southern Command and the Northern Command, and it is a very, very interesting time. I think that the most topical thing right at the moment to hear from the Southern Command is on the issue of Venezuela and what is happening down there really minute by minute. There's a lot going on in that area. And I do want to emphasize how important it is to get a stable government in Venezuela, and my belief that the Maduro government is not legitimate. The facts, I think, make that clear. And the devastation throughout Venezuela shows how their leadership has impacted that country. The statistics are staggering of the incredible rise in poverty and malnutrition, the people who are displaced. It is devastating for Venezuela, but it's also devastating for the region. Some of us were on this committee when we passed Plan Colombia, and we've worked with Colombia for literally decades now to try to combat the narco-terrorists down there, and really made an enormous amount of progress. That progress is threatened by the instability in Venezuela as refugees pour across the border and as various criminals, terrorists, and violent organizations take advantage of that instability. Trying to get back to a more stable situation in Venezuela is enormously important. We'll also be very interested by the role that both Cuba and Russia are playing in that region, as Russia in particular attempts to expand their reach. We have seen, obviously, what they've done meddling in Europe and in the Middle East, but I think this is instructive of just how ambitious President Putin's plans are to spread Russia's malign influence throughout the globe. We'll be interested in hearing about that. And the broader overarching issue with Southern Command is almost always the drug trafficking, how we can contain the drugs that flow south to north. And the one piece, and I spoke yesterday with Admiral Fuller about this, is we have to focus on I believe, total approach to this and look at the demand side of this. If there was not the demand in the United States of America for these drugs, they wouldn't come. And as long as the demand remains as high as it is, it's going to be incredibly expensive and difficult to stop them. So I think it would be instructive not to just try to stop the drug cartels from shipping them north, but what can we do to combat the entire problem, a whole of government approach, working with people here domestically in the United States to try to reduce the demand for drugs. And Northern Command, obviously, we're very focused on the southern border, and I've given speeches about that before. I won't take this moment to do that. But we do have a significant challenge on the southern border right now. The sheer number of people who are flowing towards the border is overwhelming our ability to process the asylum seekers that are coming. And we need to come up with a plan for that, because right now, the only thing that I would hope we could all agree on is what we're doing now is not working. So I would appreciate some insights about how we can change that to try to address the situation. Would only offer one specific thought. Again, like with the drugs, focusing on stopping them from coming in as opposed to stopping the demand is perhaps the wrong approach. When it comes to the border, focusing on how can we stop these people once they get here, we have to figure out some way to change the equation so that they don't want to come. The best way to do that is to have greater prosperity and stability in the countries that they are coming from. They are fleeing violence, poverty, and hopelessness. Until we replace those things, it's hard to imagine that they're going to stop making that choice. So we're going to, again, need a comprehensive approach to addressing that problem and challenge. And I look forward to the testimony from all four of our witnesses. And with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming our witnesses. Appreciate each of you being here. All of us are intensely focused on the developments in Venezuela. Week before last, I had the opportunity to be there on the border and to listen to some of the thousands of people who are streaming across that border every day and hear their desire to be freed from oppression and to have a chance for a better life. As you said, I think we all have something at stake here. I'm also very disturbed by the reports of Russian, Cuban, Chinese, other interference there. For example, I think the Secretary of State has said that Maduro was ready to leave yesterday, but the Russians wouldn't let him. So there is tremendous concern not only about the people of Venezuela, but about foreign manipulation that prevents the people of Venezuela from having a better life, and of course a lot of that is directed against us. I would also just say that my takeaway from visiting at least 3 of the countries in South America was we have tremendous opportunities there. Tremendous economic, security, all sorts of opportunities. But we also have significant concerns. Chinese involvement and the Russian, Iranian, other things that you have mentioned. A lot of issues to talk today, and Obviously, protecting the homeland is absolutely central to the purpose of the Department of Defense and the federal government, and there are a variety of ways that, a variety of concerns that we have. Last thing I would say is, and it goes beyond the scope of this committee and this hearing, but I completely agree with your statement that we need a more comprehensive approach to deal with the challenges at the southern border. Part of that is helping the countries of Central America so that people have a safer place to stay. Part of it, in my opinion, is the asylum laws in the United States. Part of it is doing better for the Department of Homeland Security so they can do their job rather than rely on the military. A lot of that is beyond our scope. I know we will talk about some of those aspects. The key thing is, maybe more so than any time I've been on this committee, our own hemisphere is at stake with American national security in ways that I think it hasn't been before. And so I think it's appropriate to have these witnesses, and I look forward to hearing their testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Rapuano, we'll start with you.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to be here with General O'Shaughnessy, Admiral Fowler, and Assistant Secretary Wilberger. For the Department of Defense, defending the homeland is our highest priority. Our homeland, once a sanctuary, is threatened by potential adversaries that are developing a wide range of capabilities to threaten the homeland. Our adversaries are developing these capabilities to threaten or to commit acts of aggression against the United States. Their actions are intended to limit U.S. response options, thus preventing us from defending our allies and partners. China and Russia, by far our most advanced potential adversaries, increasingly developing 21st century technologies to hold the U.S. homeland at risk, employing systems intended to deny our advantages, delay our warning time, and likely target our civil infrastructure. These capabilities include anti-satellite systems, hypersonic glide vehicles, and advanced cyber capabilities. While North Korea has not conducted any nuclear-capable missile tests in more than a year, it retains weapons of mass destruction. North Korea also possesses cyber capabilities and has demonstrated its intent to use them to threaten the U.S. homeland. Iran continues to work on a space launch vehicle, reducing the timeline to development of intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Although our focus is on great power competition and rogue states, we must continue to address the threat posed by violent extremist organizations. ISIS and others continue to strive for opportunities to strike the U.S. homeland. The defense of the homeland is not restricted to adversaries abroad. In providing defense support to civil authorities, my office coordinates the Department's role for disaster relief and border security support to the Department of Homeland Security. To meet this range of challenges, the administration released its national security strategy. This informed the National Defense Strategy, which in turn helped shape the National Military Strategy. A common thread throughout all these documents is the need to strengthen homeland defense by enhancing our deterrence and assurance posture, improving our ability to respond if deterrence fails, and strengthening our negotiating position against adversaries. To that end, every element of my team is focused on strengthening U.S. homeland defense. I'd like to highlight outer space. Space is a key domain for our national and homeland defense. However, the space domain is changing, and we must address growing foreign counter-space threats. Thus, the Department provided Congress a legislative proposal for the establishment of the U.S. Space Force as a new branch of our armed forces. The Space Force will catalyze the Department's transformation of space as a warfighting domain to ensure we are postured to deter aggression and, if necessary, are prepared to defend our vital interests in space. Cyber Policy's development of the Defense Cyber Strategy and first-ever Cyber Posture Review has put the Department of Defense on a path to fight and win against a capable adversary, enhance the effectiveness of the joint force, defend critical infrastructure, secure DoD information anywhere, and prioritize cyber cooperation with partners and allies. These objectives, along with our intent to defend forward, puts the United States in a far better position to protect the homeland and counter adversary aggression. Additionally, the Department is enhancing its missile defenses for the homeland and improving its ability to counter unmanned aircraft systems to further deny potential adversaries any potential advantage of using these capabilities against the homeland. Support to the homeland is not limited to countering foreign adversaries. We must also be prepared to support civil authorities. DoD actively supports the DHS mission on the border because border security is a core element of national security. The immigration crisis on the southwest border poses significant national security and humanitarian challenges for the nation and threatens to overwhelm the Department of Homeland Security. In the last 6 months, over 430,000 undocumented aliens have been apprehended on the southwest border, which already surpasses the total number of aliens apprehended in the entire fiscal year of 2018. Last month alone, over 92,000 undocumented aliens were apprehended on the border. DHS will continue to need DoD support into the foreseeable future until they have the necessary resources and tools to properly exercise their responsibilities. Each of these missions have greatly contributed to Homeland Defense and are pivotal to enhancing the U.S. deterrence and assurance posture, improving our ability to respond should deterrence fail, and strengthening our ability to deter or defeat potential adversaries that threaten our way of life. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Wheelbarger.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. We enjoy enormous potential in our hemisphere, given the significant cooperation we receive from our partners and the democratic values we share with most nations in the region. Our vision is for a hemisphere that is collaborative, prosperous, and secure. But we face significant challenges as well, and Venezuela is the foremost example. Yet we have unprecedented regional unity at this historical moment, and the United States and our international partners continue to harness diplomatic, information, and economic means to encourage a peaceful transition of power. For the Department of Defense, we have responded to Interim President Guaido's call for humanitarian aid by assisting USAID in those efforts to pre-position aid in Colombia. We face other challenges in the region as well, including autocratic regimes in Cuba and Nicaragua, terrorist and criminal organizations, trafficking, natural disasters, and external actors seeking undue influence over countries' decisions. For the department, our partnerships are paramount. We deepen our relationships to address shared challenges and focus on interoperability, intelligence sharing, science and technology cooperation, advancing cyber defenses, and expanding exercises. We counter illicit trafficking by supporting law enforcement agencies and emphasizing human rights training. We prioritize regional cooperation in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and we emphasize defense institution building because strong institutions and anti-corruption measures encourage efficiency and support legitimate government. And as we see in Venezuela, the Western Hemisphere is a region of great power competition. We counter Chinese and Russian influence by gaining the trust of our partners to achieve objectives together. Unlike relationships with Russia and China, our cooperation is built on respect, collaboration, and a desire to bolster prosperity and security for all. With that, I'll simply conclude by saying the Department takes a global view of the challenges we face and remains committed to the region. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And let me just say, you told me beforehand that your statement would be 2 minutes, and it was exactly 2 minutes. That is incredibly impressive in this line of work, so I appreciate that. General O'Shaughnessy.
Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry and distinguished members of the committee, I'm truly honored to be here today as a commander of the United States Northern Command and the U.S.-Canadian Binational Command, North American Aerospace Defense Command. I'm also proud to testify this morning alongside my good friend, Craig Fowler. And Craig and the U.S. Southcom team are vital partners and continue to bring our commands closer together to better defend our nation. And I'm also proud to appear with our great OSD partners, Assistant Secretaries Rapuano and Wilberger. U.S. Northcom and NORAD are two complementary but distinct commands driven by a single, unyielding priority, defending the homeland from attack. In this era of rapidly evolving technology and renewed great power competition, the need for energized and active defense of the homeland cannot be overstated. Revisionist powers of Russia and China have given every indication that their security strategies are based on holding the United States at risk with both conventional and nuclear weapons, and they have signaled that we must anticipate attacks against our civilian and defense infrastructure in the event of a conflict. Russia has modernized its aviation and submarine fleets and fielded long-range cruise missiles designed to evade radar detection. Russia and China continue their efforts to penetrate our networks while developing and testing hypersonic glide vehicles, and both have also established a noticeably stronger foothold in the Arctic along the northern approaches to the United States and Canada. As a result, the strategic value of the Arctic as our first line of defense has reemerged, and U.S. NORTHCOM and NORAD are taking active measures to ensure our ability to detect, track, and defeat potential threats in that region. Our adversaries have engaged in deliberate, focused efforts over a number of years to exploit our perceived weaknesses. As a result, it is clear that our homeland is not a sanctuary. Our mission to deter our adversaries is dependent on our ability to detect and defeat potential threats to our homeland. And I'm grateful to the committee for your strong support of U.S. NORTHCOM and NORAD along the lines of the efforts, for example, fielding AESA radars for our aerospace control alert fighters and improving the capability and capacity of our missile defense sensors and interceptors clearly demonstrates our shared sense of urgency. In that same spirit, we must take prudent steps now to ensure our next-generation defensive capabilities, to include a space-based sensing layer for missile defense, are not too late to need. We must develop an integrated family of systems, including undersea, terrestrial, airborne, and space-based sensors with a sense of urgency. Given the fact that our adversaries are already developing these and testing these weapons, time is of the utmost importance. And while the challenges facing us are significant, I have great faith that through collaboration with industry and harnessing the power of innovation in the United States of America, we will restore our competitive advantage and continue to outpace any adversary that might threaten our homeland. And I sincerely appreciate the committee's work to provide much-needed predictability and stability with an on-time budget in FY19. And I'm also grateful for the committee's ongoing efforts to ensure that we avoid the devastating, deep-cutting impacts that a return to sequestration would bring to the Department of Defense. U.S. NORTHCOM and NORAD work every day with our partners to keep our citizens safe while confronting challenges emanating from multiple approaches and in all domains. I especially want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the amazing men and women in the National Guard, who are great partners and critical to our ability to perform our missions. And whether intercepting Russian bombers off the coast of Alaska or providing much-needed support along our federal law enforcement partners along our southern border, the airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of U.S. NORTHCOM and NORAD are deeply committed to defending our nations. And I'm honored to represent them today, and we have the watch. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Admiral Fowler.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today with my shipmates, General O'Shaughnessy, Assistant Secretary of Defense Rapuano, and Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense Wheelbarger. Also, thanks this committee for the steadfast support you provide our men and women every day. Western Hemisphere is our shared home, our neighborhood. We're connected to the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean by shared democratic traditions, culture, and geography. From my headquarters in Doral, Florida, it takes me longer to travel to D.C. than it does to many countries in my area of responsibility. We're connected to our neighbors in every domain: sea, air, land, space, and cyber, and most importantly, shared values. Only by working together can we meet current and future global challenges. Ultimately, what we want is enemies to fear us, friends to partner with us, and the Western Hemisphere to shine as a beacon of peace, democracy, and prosperity. To ensure the security of our homeland, Southcom works closely with our interagency teammates from the Department of State, USAID, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, to name just a few. This teamwork, especially with Northern Command and the U.S. Coast Guard, is critical to mission accomplishment. Over the past 5 months, I've traveled throughout Central America, South America, and the Caribbean to get a firsthand view of the opportunities and the challenges that directly impact the security of our hemisphere and our homeland. Criminal organizations, narco-trafficking, illegal migration, violent extremists, corruption, all enabled by weak governance, are principal among these challenges. The most disturbing insight, however, that I've garnered in my time in command has been the degree to which external state actors have been rapidly expanding their presence and influence in the Western Hemisphere. Across the world, to include in our neighborhood, democratic values are under assault by China, Russia, and Iran. So how do we best counter these threats to our neighborhood? Security cooperation is our best tool to continue building on the strong partnerships in the region and turn the challenges of the hemisphere into opportunities. Our partners are doing great things every day. In this hemisphere, in our neighborhood, a little goes a long way. We need the right, focused, and consistent military presence. We cannot achieve positive results and influence outcomes without being on the playing field. But every security challenge and threat in our hemisphere is compounded by the crisis in Venezuela. Russia provides lifelines through loans, technical and military support, and rhetoric. China is Venezuela's single largest state creditor, saddling the Venezuelan people with more than $50 billion in debt and exporting surveillance technology used to monitor and repress the Venezuelan people. Iran has restarted direct flights from Tehran and reinvigorated diplomatic ties. Ever-present Cuba provides critical personnel and resources to prop up a corrupt and illegitimate dictator. In the face of this malign influence, the rest of the world unites in support of Venezuela's legitimate leader, interim President Guaido. A transition to legitimate democracy is underway. And I have a message for the professionals in the Venezuelan military and security forces. The brutal dictatorship of Maduro has led to this man-made crisis. Cuba and Russia have invaded your country and disgraced your sovereignty. You have a chance to do the right thing and alleviate the suffering of your people and your families, those you have sworn an oath to protect. When a legitimate democracy has been restored, we look forward to having you return to the profession of arms, including attendance at the United States military training and education. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thornberry, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. The Southcom team, our civilians and military members, and our families appreciate the support Congress has provided. We will continue to honor your trust and our fellow citizens have placed in us. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Admiral, I'll start with you and picking up where you left off on Venezuela. What is sort of the military's role in what's going on down there? Because I agree with your statement that Maduro is not a legitimate president. We need to have a transition to a true democracy and a legitimate leader in Venezuela. I am concerned, though, that we would think that there is some sort of role for the U.S. military, given our history down there and given what we've learned about using the military to sort of change governments. What role do you see for our military and what's going on in Venezuela, and where do you see the limits of that role?
We've been focused on working with our regional partners, intelligence sharing, information sharing, gathering and generating a shared appreciation for the complexities associated with the problem, the impacts both in Venezuela, the horrific starvation, over 90% of the population starving, and the impacts of security with the partners, and looking at a way to apply our security assistance in a mutually beneficial way. That's been the primary line of effort. Secondary line of effort has been focused on planning for non-combatant evacuation and protection of American citizens and lives within Venezuela. Prudent planning, as you'd expect, Chairman, for a combatant commander. The look in support of USAID was mentioned by our colleagues here. USAID, we've supported the delivery of humanitarian aid, and we're working and planning with USAID. And then more broadly, we're looking at a day after, when we have a democratic Venezuela, how do we work with their militaries in security cooperation that's representative of a normal mill-to-mill relationship? Those have been our priorities, sir.
But you do not see a role for the U.S. military in actually overthrowing the Maduro government, correct?
Our leadership's been clear. Should be primarily a democratic transition. We're in total support of the diplomacy, and we stand ready to support that effort, sir.
And one final question in this area on the sanctions. Obviously, Venezuela has many challenges. You've outlined some of them. What role do you see U.S. sanctions on Venezuela having played in the economic difficulties that are there? And how do you balance sort of the pressure we want to put on the regime to change with the potential impact of those sanctions?
The misery of the people of Venezuela came about as a result of the illegitimate dictator's actions and inept way with which he's run the country, and China and Cuba's complete inclusion in that problem set. The sanctions have been a necessary tool to help apply pressure to accelerate the diplomatic efforts. The misery began and ends with Maduro.
And it's worth noting that, much like Putin and Russia, a huge part of the problem is that Maduro and his cronies take all the money. They don't care about the people whatsoever. They're, running a kleptocracy there, and the people are the ones who are paying the price for that. Couple quick questions on the border side of it, and I'll shift over to the policy folks. It seems, if you go back before the Trump administration started implementing its immigration policies, we are in much worse shape now than we were when that started. Do you see any connection between a variety of those policies and what's happening on the border? And if so, have you started to talk about how you might do things differently? And I guess that's for Mr. Rapuano.
So we do not deeply assess the causation in terms of the desire of individuals to immigrate to the United States and how that contributes to illegal immigration. Our support is to Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for that mission, and we are providing support in that role, the support that's appropriate for the Department of Defense to provide.
But surely you're around for the conversations about what policy might make sense. So I'm just curious, as someone who's involved in this, and the Department of Defense is now deeply into what's going on at the border because Homeland Security has asked for a lot of money and a lot of human resources. What is your thought about how we can adjust that policy to improve the situation?
Well, I can certainly say the administration has been very focused on looking at the diplomatic, the legal, the engagement with nations that are the primary sources of illegal immigration to the United States.
Yeah, the only thing I've heard is the administration talking about how they want to cut off money from those places, which doesn't strike me as a particularly productive approach. So if you could drill down a little bit, what is the administration doing to try to look at, and specifically Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to say how can we help them towards a more stable, less desperate situation?
Well, I really cannot speak for the administration's efforts associated with engaging with countries south of the border. That's outside of my portfolio and my writ.
Anybody else want to take a stab at it?
I'll say from the perspective of the regional policy shop in OSD, we continue to focus on security cooperation efforts with Central American countries. The president has made a decision with respect to looking at our cooperation in the region, but from the DoD perspective, DoD activities are going to continue forward because the mill-to-mill relationships we find, and I'll defer to Admiral Fowler as well, are a significant source of security and stability in those countries, but in the region writ large.
And I guess that's the biggest point I want to make. There are other tools in our toolbox other than the military. In fact, we're already confronting this with the request for more mill-to-mill cooperation around Venezuela, whereas the cutoff on State Department and USAID remains in place. I just frankly do not get this administration's complete and total blind spot towards the notion that international affairs involves more than just the military. That USAID and diplomatic, cutting them off and focusing only on the military, saying to Central America, we're not going to give you any more money, just encourages more people to flow forward. That is more a message for you to deliver back to the people at the White House than anything you need to answer, but it is contributing to the problem. Because the irony for me is when the president started talking about there being an emergency at the border, there wasn't. Now there is. And I think the two are connected. So I hope we'll figure out those policies because nobody on this committee wants the Department of Defense to have their resources drained out to go to Department of Homeland Security missions. And DoD has enough to do. So we're in serious trouble down there, and we need to figure out how to better confront it. I want to give General Shaughnessy and Admiral Fowler a chance if you have any response, any ideas for how we can improve that situation. Don't go on for too long because I've over my time. I want to turn it over to somebody else, but just curious if you have any quick thoughts on that.
Chairman, I would just say from our vantage point, we have a role to support our CBP partners, and from the NORTHCOM perspective, we're executing that role in the mission that we've been given to support CBP.
Okay.
I'll be in Honduras Monday next week as co-host of a Central America Security Conference with all the Central American countries, including some of the neighbors. This will be a topic of what we can do, working mutually together to better the security of both their countries and the United States homeland.
Yeah, and again, I hope we can include more folks than just on the security side. There's a very complex humanitarian problem down there. I think there are a lot of tools in our toolbox. We have a lot of allies and neighbors throughout the region who could help. We need to start employing all of those tools because it is a serious situation, as we all know. Mr. Thornberry.
Admiral, I appreciate the statements you made, particularly at the end, making an appeal to the Venezuelan military. It seems to me that a relatively small number of people have the future of their country in their hands. One of these days, the Venezuelan people are going to have a say, and the question is how long the suffering's got to go on. And there are folks now who are making decisions that for which they may be held accountable someday. And so I appreciate that appeal. General, I wanted to ask you briefly, you mentioned space-based sensors. Can you just, again, briefly describe why it is important that we have space-based sensors to defend the homeland?
Thank you for that opportunity. Clearly, as we look at the advanced threats that we're facing, both from Russia and China, they're of a changing nature. And our current sensors that we have are just not situated to be able to be effective against that. Part of it's just the track that the weapon would take is not conducive to a terrestrial-based sensing grid. And therefore, if we look to the space-based sensors, it gives you the opportunity, for example, a hypersonic track, that you could maintain the track from birth to death, right? You could see it from the time it launched to the time that we were able to take that intercept out with an interceptor or directed energy or some sort of ability to defend against it. Right now, if we just put more money into just what we're doing today with the terrestrial-based sensors, we will never get to the point where we can actively defend against them. So the space-based sensing layer, to me, is absolutely critical if we're going to be able to defend against these advanced threats.
I appreciate it. I suspect there's more detail we can get into in a classified session, but I think that's helpful. Mr. Rapuano, Chairman said this, I think we all agree. We face an unprecedented situation at the border. The Border Patrol is completely overwhelmed. Reports this week are that military folks are going to be asked to do more tasks at the border than they have been doing before. My question to you is, why can we not use contractors for these support activities that we are now asking the military to do? Anytime any of us visit Afghanistan, other places around the world, a lot of the people doing the cooking, the cleaning, the driving, monitoring sensors are often contractors. Why can't we use contractors?
So the Department of Homeland Security and CBP have been using contractors, but what they describe to us is there's a practical limit. There are, in terms of availability of contractors in the areas where they seek to have the work done and the timelines associated with getting those contractors on task. In addition to that, there are certain functions that are DoD military capabilities, sensors, the barrier construction in terms of the concertina wire, for which we do have ready capabilities. In the other areas, and you described some of them in terms of the logistics management for migrant processing, that is not necessarily a lead military skill, but it certainly is a capability that we can provide in exigent circumstances such as being experienced today.
Well, I hope that as DOD considers requests from the Department of Homeland Security, that you look at independently the availability of contractors to perform some of these functions, especially as the ask of our military expand. I know we can do it. The question is it are U.S. military people the best entity to be deploying wire? As I say, contractors run sensors all over the world, and the other logistical support. I think that's maybe a better way forward than to continue to expand the job of our military. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and your service to the country. Just to follow up on the Chairman's discussion on Venezuela, just so we're clear, first of all, I agree with where the discussion was going, that we need to apply maximum diplomatic pressure and resolve the situation with Venezuela diplomatically. But just so we don't leave anything hanging out there, we're not missing something. Have any of you in any way, shape, or form been given instruction by your leadership to prepare for any type of military conflict? Just want to make sure that we're clear on that. So pre-positioning troops or any kind of forces, we run down the line.
We, of course, always review available options and plan for contingencies, but in this case, we have not been given the sort of orders that you're discussing, no.
Okay. General, Admiral, or Ms. Secretary?
The mission sets that I discussed with respect to the chairman's question are our principal focus, really focusing on building those partnerships, leveraging our partners, making sure that whatever happens in the future, and we know we won't be able to predict it, that we are ready to approach this together as a united region and working with our militaries has been our principal line of focus.
General.
So we're just in support of Admiral Fowler in the Southcom aspect, but nothing directly, just helping Admiral Fowler.
Okay. Ms. Secretary, anything you want to add?
No,
Okay,
nothing
thanks.
additional to add.
Okay, thank you. Just want to get that on the record. General O'Shaughnessy, if I could, I'm pleased that DHS's CISA has assigned a liaison officer to NORTHCOM headquarters, and I hope that the interagency partnership will enhance the resilience of U.S. critical infrastructure, particularly in a time of crisis. What I wanted to ask is, how are you and your counterparts institutionalizing the relationship, though, so that it's not just personality-driven or public attention-driven, and that you're exercising the various scenarios under which CISA may call upon NORTHCOM for support?
Thank you for the opportunity to highlight the close coordination and collaboration we have with the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically with respect to CISA. As you mentioned, literally within the first week of it standing up, we actually had exchanged liaisons back and forth that are full-time within each other's headquarters. And these are well-seasoned professionals who truly understand the nature of the threats that we face. Part of the way as we go forward is we are inserting ourselves and have inserted ourselves inside the battle rhythm of each other's headquarters. And so every day we have integration and coordination in the various issues that we're working. Under Secretary Nielsen, and we'll continue on, no doubt, with Acting Secretary McElwain. I actually met with them on a bi-weekly basis where we talk about not only the support to the border, but things like we're doing to support the critical infrastructure. And to the point of how do we institutionalize it, we're bringing it into our exercises. We're bringing it into both our annual exercises as well as the longer-term exercises to make sure that we do it all the way from a tabletop exercise to a full interagency exercise, that we do this together, because you simply can't separate Homeland Defense and Homeland Security. They are intertwined in ways that we need to collaborate together, not on a one-off event, not when a crisis happens, but every day.
Excellent. Thank you. The exercising part of that is essential. I agree, especially. How are you working with U.S. Cybercom also to ensure that it's prepared to support you if you're called upon in a DISCA role, and I'm thinking particularly of coordination with the national mission teams?
Yeah, thank you for that. We have kind of twofold interaction with Cyber Command in this area. One is for our own systems. Right? We have our own systems designed to defend the United States and Canada that we want to make sure are able to survive any attacks, any attempts to take them down, not only in crisis, but day to day. And so we have a day-to-day engagement with Cyber Command and their cyber teams that are actually in support of us on a regular basis. We have two actively engaged as we speak right now. In addition to that, though, as we look at the broader protection of the nation, we also, to your point, use the DISCA model of how we can work with Cyber Command to present that force to both our state, for example, within the elections was an example in 2018, how we present the force throughout the nation, both on a critical infrastructure, things like election. And that DISCA model with us is essentially the DoD synchronizer, has proven to be quite effective in hurricanes, wildfires, and so we're approaching that with the same model as we look at the cyber, and have had great success already and look forward to maturing that as we go forward.
Thank you very much.
I would just add to that, at the departmental level, the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security now have a memorandum of agreement signed last year by Secretary Mattis and Secretary Nielsen, in which we are working with them across the board, starting with defense critical infrastructure as well as civil infrastructure. How are we prioritizing between the Department of Defense and DHS and the other sector lead agencies? And then how are we looking at where and how we support them best?
Absolutely. The gentleman's time has expired, and I apologize. I should have warned the witnesses. We try to keep it to 5 minutes. I will not cut you off in mid-sentence or anything, but once we hit 5 minutes, we do try to move on to other folks, even if you're in mid-question. At that point, we probably take it for the record. If you have an answer you want to submit to the member, you can do that then. Mr. Wilson.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here in your service to our country. Admiral Fowler, I'm grateful for the relationship of the U.S. Southern Command maintains with the Republic of Colombia as part of the National Guard State Sponsorship Program. Since 2012, South Carolina and Colombia have partnered to enhance military cooperation with the rotary wing and air defense capabilities. As Colombia continues to expand as a NATO global partner, how do you judge the strategies for Plan Colombia? Specifically, what are the investments DoD is making to combat terrorist activities and drug trafficking to continue the successes?
We'll start with the South Carolina Guard, a fantastic partner. In fact, they're down there this week working with the Colombians. They'll be down later this summer for an air defense exercise with some of our high-end capability exercising with Colombians. And we're very appreciative of the National Guard, what they do across the range of security cooperation. There's absolutely a wonderful partnership. Colombia their military and security forces are making a difference, and they are taking the attack to the narco traffickers. They're taking it to the ELN, the FARC dissidents, and the results that we'll see in eradication, plateau and cocoa production, high interdiction rates. These are going to have an impact on both the internal security of Colombia and the United States security. A very capable partner. I have the utmost trust for the Colombian Armed Forces and what they do as professionals and what they do in terms of their warfighting ability.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Wilbarger, Russia and China are expanding their presence in Latin America. They're using economic and military influence to strategically compete against U.S. in this vital region and systematically engage with the autocratic regimes. Admiral Fowler has already cited Russia and Cuba are increasing military intelligence activities in Venezuela. What types of equipment, aircraft, or capabilities are you most concerned about?
I'll defer to Admiral Fowler for the specific technical concerns, but in terms of Russia and Chinese influence writ large in the region, we're very focused on countering that influence with our own productive activities, with building partner capacity. As I discussed in the opening, we really see our national defense strategy encourages us as a department to look at these as global threats, and that includes countering the influence in our region. Or in our hemisphere, excuse me. Therefore, we are consistently and continuously looking for opportunities to build our partners and build new relationships, and we have a significant opportunity right now to do so. With respect to their specific activity in Venezuela, as it was cited at the beginning this morning with respect to Secretary Pompeo's statements, it's not just technical concerns that we have, but it's just the overall influence that they can have and bear on the decision-making of these countries. And that's why we as an international community call on Russia and China in particular to cease their support to the Maduro regime.
Thank you. And General O'Shaughnessy, the North American Aerospace Command is improving defense coverage of the National Capital Region. The South Carolina National Guard currently has personnel in the region to support this mission. What is your timeline of the three-phase plan to expand the National Capital Region architecture to protect the rest of the country? And are you working with our neighbor Canada?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And as you highlight, the Guard participation in all the defense within NORAD and NORTHCOM is significant. And the example you use in the National Capital Region, as we sit right here today, we have Guardsmen on alert protecting us literally as we sit here today. And so my hat's off to the great support that we get from them. Now, with respect to the specifically the Homeland Defense Design Phase 1 and Phase 2 are actually funded in Phase 1 in place, Phase 2 ongoing now. As we look to Phase 3, it becomes significantly more complicated as the threat has continued to develop as well. And so we're continuing to refine what that Homeland Defense design should look like going into the future with the advanced threats, hypersonics, et cetera, cruise missiles that we know we have to defend against. And we are using the basis from the Homeland Defense Phase 1 and 2 as the starting point, but in a much more complicated and complex manner to defend both the United States and Canada.
And the level of synchronization with Canada?
Extreme. NORAD's 60 years of history of the great relationship with NORAD and the modernization within NORAD. We're trying to look binationally. I can submit for the record some studies that we're doing binationally with Canada in the interest of time, but we are looking at this together with Canada.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Larson.
Thank you. General, the Coast Guard came out with their Arctic strategy a few weeks ago. It's called Protecting Sovereignty. The administration under General Mattis at the time said that it had an updated military strategy in June. Is that, will we have that by June?
I will defer to OSD on that. We have been working with the OSD office that is working that strategy.
All right. OSD, is that going to be done by June?
My belief is I currently understand that it will be. I was seeing sort of final deliberations over the last couple of weeks, so we will get you an update if it's not, if we think it's going to be delayed for any reason.
Please do that. Thank you. And back to General then. Could you talk a little bit, in your testimony, pages 11 through 12-ish or so, you know, you're the DoD advocate for Arctic capabilities and the combatant commander responsible for independent approach to the homeland. Rather than get into what Russia and China are doing, could you just review your testimony a little bit for us on what we are doing? Because this is, the Arctic has been an obvious interest for us for a long time. What are we doing that isn't in response to Russia and China? What are we doing because we ought to be doing it for our own reasons?
Right, and really, as we look at the Arctic, it is a very difficult operating environment, and so we feel that we need the ability to operate in that environment. And so, for example, the work we're doing at the Jay Park Range in Alaska gives us the ability to train our force in ways that we haven't been getting after for the last several decades. If you look at the work that we're doing, the U.S. Navy, for example, sailed the Harry S. Truman in the high north that we hadn't done in literally decades. And so we are really trying to, from exposing our team, our airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, to that environment and making sure that we are prepared to operate. Just last week, I personally went out to Thule Air Base in Greenland. I went up to Nunavik in higher areas of Canada. And I will tell you firsthand, those conditions that we're going to ask our force to operate in are extreme, and you can't go there without the adequate preparation and training. The second thing we're looking on is actually what do we need to be able to operate there? So we look at domain awareness. We look at our ability to communicate. Many of the traditional means of communication simply don't work in the Arctic. We're looking at our ability to sustain those operations there so that once we have the training, we'll have the ability to actually have a force with an infrastructure that will actually support them in a sustained way. The way we're looking to advocate for that is we are working closely with UCOM and PACOM so as we can be the lead, but it is not something that is just done alone at NORTHCOM and NORAD. It is done in coordination with our sister combatant commands, but it's also done, for example, with the Coast Guard. And as they are looking to get the heavy icebreaker, critically important for us. And so it's that coordination and doing these things together. We're running symposiums. We're trying to be a little bit of the vocal advocate for it, not only within DoD, but within the interagency as well. And we'll continue to take those measures.
How are you using the CONUS bases as platforms for deployment?
Well, I think as we look at some of the places here within the CONUS, we have, for example, the Air National Guard, the 109th, has the LC-130s that have capability that is absolutely critical for us. And so being able to use that, in fact, they were up at Greenland last week as well. They're up there for about a 4-month tour. They'll also go down to Antarctica, but making sure we use that capability and that expertise. Now, as far as other bases within the U.S., in the CONUS, We try to take advantage of some of the experiences that we have that we can leverage forward. What we see right now is look at, for example, some of the operations that we see are just a lack of experience of being in those environments.
Yeah, thanks. Secretary Wheelbarger, we'll expect then maybe just by the end of the week, get us an update on more precise timeline.
Yeah, we'll get you an update by the end of the week.
That'd be great. Thank you. And I'll yield back to myself and recognize Ms. Hartzler for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General O'Shaughnessy, the F-15C fleet based within the U.S. is tasked with, as you know, supporting our top mission of defending the homeland. And the Air Force plans to refresh the F-15C fleet with the F-15EX and has requested funding for 8 aircraft in the FY20 budget. So how would bringing advanced F-15s into these units impact NORTHCOM in terms of the capacity and capabilities available for the Homeland Defense?
Well, ma'am, as you, I think you know, the Air Force has very publicly talked about they need 72 aircraft a year in their procurement in order to sustain and grow the Air Force to the size that it needs to be. We are one of those requirements, right? We are one of the forcing agents for the U.S. Air Force to respond to that demand signal. And so we are very supportive of the work that they are doing to maintain a capability and capacity to support all the requirements. We also understand that they're committed to 5th gen, and that hasn't changed as we do go forward. But as we look at the readiness capability of a sustained 4th gen fleet, it needs to be refreshed. And as such, we are looking forward to continue to work with the Air Force, make sure they provide us the capability and capacity we need, and we support the Air Force's initiatives going forward.
So you support their plan to buy more F-15Es?
Right. We are fairly agnostic to the platform in the sense of a capability, a capacity that we need them to have, and so I do support General Goldfein, Secretary Wilson, and the approach that they have taken to have both readiness and capability and capacity available for us as a combatant commander.
So the Air Force has testified that converting F-15C squadrons to the F-15EX will better support the needs of the Air Force and combatant commands by minimizing the downtime of mission conversion. Compared to the years it would take to convert to an entirely new platform, the Air Force believes units transitioning between F-15 variants would take just months. Looking at the forces available to NORTHCOM today, how important is that mission conversion timeline to meeting your requirements?
Well, ma'am, the service will be ultimately responsible for that, but what we can't afford is a gap, right? We cannot have a gap in the capability and the capacity. As we sit here today, you know, we have 5 different F-15 units that support us within NORAD. It is an important platform for us, and in the end, we can't afford to have any detriment in the capacity or capability we have supporting NORAD.
Okay. In your written testimony, you discussed the challenges of unmanned aerial systems in the U.S. airspace and the importance of the authorities provided to DOJ and DHS in the recent FAA Reauthorization Act. DOD has also received counter-UAS authorities in both the FY17 and FY18 NDAAs. How is NORTHCOM using the granted DOD authorities, and have any gaps been identified from a COCOM perspective?
Ma'am, I'd first like to start by thanking you and your team for the great support that we've had with respect to these authorities over the last several years, of not only for the DOD, because it's an important aspect for us, for our authorities, but as you mentioned, the interagency is equally as important. And so as we work closely with Department of Homeland Security, and as you work to help get them the similar authorities that we have within DOD, that has been extremely helpful. The example I use is right here within the National Capital Region, where we're working closely with many sub-organizations within DHS, but also DOJ, the Capitol Police, the local police, and the individual services, as we work an exercise here in about 2 weeks to try to bring all that together. And it is very complex. And so it's a question of the authorities we have and then the tools and the kit that we have to actually defeat any threat that we have with the counter-UAS. So the exercises that we're doing are driving us to better understand if there are additional authorities or requirements that we might have, and we'll stay in close coordination and collaboration with your team and this committee as we go forth potentially with more authorities that we'll be seeking.
Yeah, appreciate your work on that and look forward to continuing to work with you on it, because it is such a very important mission. And lastly, another question. I'm proud to, as you know, represent Fort Leonard Wood in my district, which contributes vital capabilities to NORTHCOM by training service members for specialties such as military police and the CBRN response. In your written testimony, you discussed Northcom's defense support of civil authorities' mission and provided many examples of interagency coordination. Can you talk in more detail about coordination and training activities among DoD CBRN specialists and civilian CBRN experts aimed at protecting the homeland?
Yes, ma'am. And let me first thank you, and actually Fort Leonard Wood is instrumental to our ability to have this capability. We have about 18,000 personnel at any given time that are committed to the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response efforts. We have 57 CST or teams that are designed within the states to be able to respond. And those, almost to a person, they're trained at Fort Leonard Wood. And it's also the training they do is also within the interagency and the local law enforcement officials and the first responders that they'll work with. And so I know we're short on time, but I'll just say absolutely critical, and we would not be able to do it without the expertise resident there. And it is not just within DoD, but within the broader response.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Again, looking at the sort of mission of Southern Command, and I think it's been referenced by some prior remarks, obviously the migration issue in terms of where there's instability is certainly the issue of the day. The administration's decision to cut aid to the Northern Triangle countries, again, I think has just totally flabbergasted people in terms of how that possibly helped stabilize that situation. Mr. Chairman, I have a statement that was signed by 5 combatant commanders of the U.S. Southern Command, General Craddock, General Hill, General McCaffrey, Admiral Stavridis, General Wilhelm, who all basically make the point that the solution in terms of the drivers that cause people to leave their country and move north, that cutting aid to the region will only increase the drivers and will be even more costly to deal with our border. I'd ask that it be admitted to the record.
That's 5 former combatant commanders.
Correct.
But yes, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Yeah, no slight intent, Admiral. And I want to thank you for being here today. It's good to see you back on the Hill. Again, maybe Ms. Wheelbarger or Mr. Rapuano can respond to that question. How on earth cutting aid, which doesn't go to the governments, they actually go to NGOs, faith-based groups, all the folks who are trying to help individuals who are definitely in crisis in economies and almost failed states in those regions, how that's going to help us at the border deal with this problem.
I'll just start by saying, as I explained before, we are continuing our mill-to-mill and MOD to DoD partnerships in the region as much as we can. We will inevitably be impacted somewhat by the ending or the pausing of State Department support. We agree that it is important to do all we can to bring stability and security to the regions, both to the central region, but also around the hemisphere. And that a key part of that, again, is an interagency process that uses a whole-of-government approach. I think our perspective is that we will be reviewing what our security cooperation is in light of the decision, and we're reviewing foreign assistance writ large in the region over the coming weeks and months.
As those former combatant commanders stated pretty powerfully, is that military alone cannot strengthen the investments for development and deployment. And the other whole of government has to be part of the effort, and otherwise, you're just chasing something that you'll never catch in terms of trying to deal with this issue. Admiral, we talked yesterday about the flow of drugs into our country, particularly New England, which has been hard hit by the addiction issue. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your efforts with the Coast Guard in terms of interdiction.
The drugs and the deaths as a result of drugs in this country are certainly a national security crisis. The flow of those drugs, cocaine principally from Colombia, heroin from Mexico, and then fentanyl from China and other sources, all mixed together in a concoction that's killing our citizens. The Coast Guard is our #1 partner. At our Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, we have 20 partner nations and all elements of the U.S. government laser focused on this across both the NORTHCOM and the SOUTHCOM boundaries, because, as you know, sir, the drug traffickers know no seams. They exploit them. The Coast Guard's presence any given day is 6 to 8 cutters, assets beyond that, and our Navy's now stepping up. This fall we'll have a littoral combat ship. But keep in mind, we're talking about covering an area the size of the United States with from 6 to 10 ships. And so the interdiction percentage with the current assets we have is about 6% of the detections. So we need more ships, we need more intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to include maritime patrol aircraft. The Navy's contributed 2 P-8s. Customs Borders Protection has some P-3s in the hunt, and those are our critical needs.
And you mentioned the littoral combat ship as being an additional asset that maybe can be brought to this mission. I mean, can you talk quickly about where that stands?
We'll get
By
our
quickly, he means 5 seconds.
We'll get our first one this fall. The Navy needs more ships. We welcome those ships in Southcom.
Okay, very good. Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. General O'Shaughnessy, always good to see you, and welcome to our community. I'd like to ask a question about missile defense, and then a more Colorado-based question. But first of all, and Mr. Raprano, if you want to weigh in on this also, you'd be welcome to. Given that the redesigned kill vehicle schedule continues to slide to the right, do you think it makes sense to consider next generation solutions? And I'm thinking of the MOKV, the multiple object kill vehicle, because the threat is out there and we don't want to get caught with the threats not being able to address the threats. So MOKV, should we start working on that and accelerate our work on that?
Well, thank you, sir. First, I would say with respect to the RKV, I do have a concern, as you would expect, from the operational perspective of the delay as it hit the critical design review and was not ready to move forward. So we've been working closely with General Greaves, MDA. In fact, immediately after that was highlighted, I went down to the headquarters personally, met not only with General Greaves, but the technical experts to better understand not just the RKV, but the broader system of systems and things that we could do. From my perspective, I'm very concerned about the overall capacity and capability. In other words, if we look at North Korea as an example, there's a capability that we need to have to be able to intercept any missiles they shoot, but there's also a capacity that we need to maintain. And so we want to make sure that between the radars, between the kill vehicles, that we maintain ahead of that capacity. So without getting a technical discussion, which of course we'd have to go classified, I would say that it's really a bit of both. In other words, I don't know that you can just skip the RKV, but certainly the MOKV needs to be continued to be pursued because, as you highlighted, it does give you the ability to go after multiple objects. And so I think as we go forward, we can have a follow-on discussion to classified, but I do believe we need to continue to pursue the RKV, but also look at the MOKV.
Okay.
MOKV.
Well, thank you, General. Mr. Raprano, would you want to weigh in on that?
I think General O'Shaughnessy covered it quite well. It's really what the trade space is in terms of time as well as capabilities between RKV and MOKV, and those are the things that we're looking at because we see adversaries continuing to develop their capabilities, but we want to make sure that the trade we make is a balanced trade.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, General O'Shaughnessy, I want to ask you about a Colorado-specific question. As you know, in northwest Colorado, we have the HATS site, or the High Altitude Army and National Guard Aviation Training Site, and that's on public land. There's been legislation introduced by some of the Colorado delegation to declare large areas of Colorado wilderness, and I'm sure this is unintentional, but it could have the effect of shutting down that aviation training site because wilderness use is very limited, very stringently controlled. So do you have concerns about this legislation, which is H.R. 823, and how it might affect the HATS site and affect firefighting as well?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm not. I don't have a direct involvement in that as a Northcom or NORAD, but I clearly understand the dilemma that this would put us in within the services. And so I do look forward to working with your team going forward to see if there's something we can do together to address this issue.
Okay, we'll stay in touch with you on that. It is a work in progress. I just wanted to get you to weigh in on that because it is of concern in our state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Fowler, you indicated that one of your responsibilities is drug interdiction. Is that correct?
It's a detection, monitoring, and then the interdiction as well, yes, sir.
Thank you. How do most drugs enter the United States?
Most drugs come through the United States, crossing in through Central America, up through Mexico, across the border, and also through the other means, containers, the mails, the ports, particularly the fentanyl, which has been the latest trend.
Okay. How about the oceans or the Caribbean and the Pacific?
Sort of both the Caribbean and the Pacific are high transit areas as the drugs flow out of.
Those drugs that enter through the, from Mexico, enter through the ports of entry or through unsealed border?
So I'd defer to General O'Shaughnessy on the entry.
So I would say both, and as we work with our Customs Border Protection, we certainly see it through the ports of entry, we certainly see it through the containers, but we also see it through the open border.
I see. How best can we spend $6 to $8 billion on border fences or on Coast Guard activities, littoral combat ships, improvement of our detection at the port of entries? How would we best spend $6 to $8 billion?
Sir, from my perspective, it's a little bit. It's not one silver bullet that's going to defeat this threat to our nation.
So, how much would you apply to border walls versus ports of entry?
I would defer to policy on the specifics of that. But what I would say is,
Mr.
really needs to be a little bit of everything.
So border barriers is one approach in terms of.
No, the question was how best. Where would we best spend the money?
So if we were solely considering counter-narcotics as the primary function that we were investing in addressing versus all the other dynamics associated with the border?
My question is drugs. How best could we spend the money?
Well, I can't.
Would you spend it on the Coast Guard? Would you spend it on ports of entry? Or would you spend it on walls?
I don't have the counter-drug portfolio.
It's your task. You're not going to answer the question.
No, I simply don't have the information to answer the question in terms of looking at drugs solely versus looking at border security or operational control of the border, which are two primary.
Thank you. And you're not answering the question. Could you please provide me with the data? Thank you. General O'Shaughnessy, we have missile threats, we have cyber threats. What is the most imminent of those two threats?
Sure, I think in the near term, cyber threats are happening every day, quite literally. That said, I do have significant concern on the kinetic or missile threats as well.
So cyber threat is the most imminent, that is here and now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And with regard to the cyber threat, amongst those threats, what is the most imminent of those threats?
Sure. I think as we look at what is happening every day within our infrastructure, when I say our infrastructure, I mean as a nation, not as the Department of Defense. Clearly, we see both Russia, China working in malicious ways.
Okay, including things like elections. Therefore, where should we apply our money and our talent and task? To the immediate problem or to the long-term problem? I understand we'll probably do both, but is our relationship?
Well, sir, I do believe it's not one silver bullet that's going to take care of all of the threats that we're faced with. So it is both. I know from our cyber command is working diligently on the cyber threat.
Thank you, and I'll just get back on it here. We have an imminent threat, immediate threat. We need to attend to that immediately. The long-term threat, missile defense and so forth are also out there. I understand that. What is the single point of failure in the American system of our electronic systems? It's GPS. It's been identified by the federal government for the last 25 years as the single point of failure. We lose GPS, these lights go out, your cell phone won't work, nothing will work. Most of the military equipment won't work. Is there a backup system to GPS?
I'm sure what I'd like to do is address that in a classified environment with you.
My time is out. The answer is there is one available but does not yet exist, and it is a problem for the continental United States. It is called ELRAN.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, lady and gentlemen, for being here, and thank you for the work that you do. I wasn't here earlier, and you may have already addressed this, and if you did, if you would just quickly summarize it, but I'd like to know from your perspective, I know you're not the Department of State, where we are today with regard to the situation in Venezuela.
I'll start. I think from our perspective, we continue to see the policy and our strategy of multilateral, international, diplomatic, and economic pressure on the Maduro clique as working. The kind of regional support we see in rallying against him and for the interim president is a historical moment. We will be watching over the course of today as events unfold, because there has been calls for further protests. I think yesterday was a significant day, but we are watching what's unfolding today as well, because they have called for further protests, and we are seeing further pressure put on Maduro around the international community, but also from within his own system.
Are there concerns that what's happening in Venezuela might destabilize some of their neighbors who are allies of ours in that region?
Of course, that's a significant challenge we face and we focus on, particularly given the migrant flows into Colombia and Brazil in particular. These are solid, important partners in the region for us and for regional stability, and so we remain focused and concerned about the potential spillover effects to the region.
All right, thank you. Admiral, let me ask you about China in Latin America. They seem to be growing their footprint there, One Belt, One Road, other things that they're doing there. I know you can't address all of that from your perspective, but from your perspective, what can you address, and tell me about what you can do and what we can do to help you to try to push back against China in our own neighborhood?
The National Defense Strategy rightly calls out China as a competitor. It's gone beyond that around the world, frankly. We're in conflict with China in the information space and for the values and democracy. We see that in this hemisphere, over 60 port projects. That includes what we see in the NORTHCOM and the SOUTHCOM, 56 in SOUTHCOM in the Caribbean. They've locked up big development areas, both sides of the Panama Canal, significant IT infrastructure investments. They have military dimensions to their involvement in space stations in a couple of the nations. Any discussion by China that this is soft power is simply not the truth. In the information space, we see where China state spokesmen are outright just blatantly lying about some of the causality in Venezuela with respect to the electrical infrastructure, which was clearly Maduro's ineptness is the reason why the country doesn't have electrical power, and China blaming it on the U.S. So across the front, democracy, human rights, rule of law, sovereignty, our partners and the values that this neighborhood has are aligned on those dimensions, and I don't know how I know how China's don't align across those dimensions. And so the best response for us is to be that strong, reliable, consistent partner, to be able to deliver our security assistance on time with a program that has a return on investment for America and enhances the security of our partners. That starts with intelligence sharing. I get my best advice, best insights from the Chief of Defense. Yesterday, for example, on the phone with the Brazilian Chief of Defense and the Colombian Chief of Defense with respect to insights on the Venezuela situation. But again, back to China, completely unhelpful in Venezuela and across the hemisphere. The one belt, one road in front of that term is certainly epitomizes what they're up to. One way for China's way.
Well, I get concerned sometimes. We look at China and we think about the South China Sea and places over there in the Western Pacific, and we forget that they're present in our own hemisphere. And I'm concerned about that. I think a lot of us are very concerned about that, and we want to make sure that we're giving you the resources you need to accomplish what you have to accomplish in your mission, that is to protect us and protect our neighbors in this hemisphere. So please let us know in the future what you need for us to give to you that you need to do your job, and I'd like for us to do it. General, if we could very quickly, I'm going to run out of time, I'd like to know if a space sensor would address Northcom's requirements for missile detection and tracking for both ballistic and hypersonic missiles.
Yes, sir. My view is that it's absolutely critical for us to have a space-based sensing layer, a peripheralator LEO approach to get after the advancing threats that we see with both ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hypersonics, as you mentioned.
Good. Mr. Chairman, my time's about to run out, but I would make this observation. It's pretty easy to look around the world and think that our greatest threats are in Asia or in the Middle East or with Russia, but we see a lot of those same threats visiting themselves here in North America and in South America, and I hope that we'll never forget that it's our homeland that makes the most importance to her and our neighbors to our south. So I hope you'll let us know what we can do to be supportive of you. Thank you. I yield back.
And that point is worth emphasizing. We have had, obviously, a focus in the National Security Armed Services Committee on the Middle East, and while Afghanistan and Iraq, dominated in the Middle East and the Asian region. And as a consequence, and we haven't touched on this yet today, a lot of assets are not available to the Southern Command. They've been redirected. Now, that's coming back a little bit since we've drawn down completely out of Iraq. Or we were completely out of Iraq, drawn down considerably in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it is a challenge for all of these missions that we're talking about, that you've kind of been at the back of the buffet line here in terms of assets. So we need to, I think, reemphasize the importance of this region. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to Representative Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego. Thank you all for being here today. I just want to follow up on Mr. Courtney's question regarding the letter from the former Southcom commanders. Secretary Pompeo dismissed the State Department statistics that suggested U.S. aid programs in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, had an impact on reducing homicide rates and migrants fleeing their countries, suggesting that the aid programs really had no positive impact at all. Admiral Fowler, I know you're new to the position, but can I just get your assessment on what impact you think those aid programs will have on how you can do your job and be successful down there in those three countries?
I had the opportunity to visit Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala within weeks of taking command because of the importance that region has and the connection with the United States, our neighborhood. And I'll be in Honduras next week again. I had the opportunity in each country to go visit some of the poorest neighborhoods, and I wanted to talk to people and find out what was on their minds, what was influencing them to make decisions, whether to turn to crime, organized crime, or to travel to the United States. And one conversation with a young man who'd gone all the way to the border of Mexico and the U.S. and come back just resonates with me. And I said to him, well, why did you leave? And he said, well, my neighbors had some food because they had family in the United States sending money back. We were starving, and I knew how dangerous this was. The government was broadcasting the messages, but I wanted to keep my family from starving, so I went anyway. I said, why did you come back? He said, because it was really, really dangerous when I got up on the border. So there's not one solution set, sir. It's got to be a broad series of kits that work, a suite, and the nations have to play and participate as well. And so all those dynamics got to fit together and create sustainable security at home and here. We forget sometimes that these are fragile democracies that are less than a generation old, that we're going through civil war in our lifetime. So that plays into this too. I will say, with respect to mill-to-mill, the programs are working. I won't assess, I can't assess USAID versus everything else, but in Guatemala, the special forces that we've trained are stopping drugs that are flowing to the United States. And as Ms. Wilberger, Secretary Wilberger said, those programs are going to be permitted to continue at the mill-to-mill level.
So would you say you agree with the statement from your predecessors that diplomacy and USAID is an important part and that it's needed there down in those regions?
Those are highly esteemed mentors I respect. From a fundamental principle around the world, it's important to have diplomacy and all the toolkits available. But I also would pivot to say, I think ensuring that our partners are doing their part and putting pressure on them is an important part of the equation. And so I have actually seen evidence that the additional pressure we're placing on this being true partnership, two-way, is changing some dynamics in a helpful way.
Mr. Rapuano, news reports indicate that the Acting Secretary of Defense sent a memo to the Comptroller requesting by May 10th a list of military construction projects of sufficient value to provide up to $3.6 billion in funding for his consideration to defer in favor of the President's border wall. This committee has yet to receive that memo. Can you assure me that the memo will be shared with this committee, and when will it be shared?
I can assure you the memo will be shared as soon as possible. You're talking about the memo in which he makes a decision with regard to 2808?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he fully intends, and he has stated so, that he will be sharing this with Congress.
All right. And is the Comptroller, he's in process of identifying specific projects. Has he made a determination yet that the border wall is necessary to support troops?
He is still awaiting the Joint Staff assessment with regard to the role that the barriers play. And when he receives that assessment, he will make the decision.
All right. So have you been involved in those conversations regarding what criteria beyond simple no forms of military housing projects that have been already awarded or will be awarded this fiscal year will be followed to identify military construction projects that will be delayed to pay for the President's wall? If so, what are that criteria?
And that we're going to have to take for the record, because we're just completely out of time, and I'm pretty sure the answer
Provided for the record.
Wouldn't be terribly satisfactory anyway. Just for the committees, we have not yet been told what projects are the money's going to be taken from. We continue to ask that question in a variety of different forums, and the sooner we can get that answer, I wouldn't go so far as to say the happier we're all going to be, but at least the more informed we will all be about what our challenges are. So we are still waiting to find out exactly where that money's going to go.
And that decision has not been made by the Secretary yet.
Right, apparently. But as soon as it is, we'd like to know what it is. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. General O'Shaughnessy, thank you for visiting my office yesterday. Can you describe NORTHCOM's role in the Missile Defense Agency's decision-making process for determining the benefits and location of potential third continental interceptor site on the East Coast?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for the time yesterday to talk about this and other issues. NORTHCOM, as the operator, if you will, has a significant input with MDA relative to what that future would look like. We started with over 50 different locations that we're looking at. We work closely with MDA for our operational criteria that we want to be included in that. We provide an assessment to MDA and work with MDA for that, and that has been incorporated into the MDA's ongoing work in this regard.
Thank you. Can you expand upon the operational criteria?
Sure, without going into great classified detail, but broadly what we're looking at is, as you know, we have two interceptor sites already, one at Fort Greely and one in California at Vandenberg. One of the opportunities this would provide us is a dispersal for that. It would potentially give us the opportunity for a shoot, look, shoot, and that's just pure geometry and geography, if you look at what that would allow us to do. And of course, we need other sensors to be able to actually be able to take full advantage of that. And of course, we want to look at what is the effectiveness of the location in order to defend our defended area, which obviously includes the United States.
And in terms of your assessment, we're working with the SecDef to get a timeline as to when the preferred site would be announced. So without getting into the specific site, can you expand upon how the recommendation and assessment was given to MDA? And by that I mean, did you rank the 3 sites? Did you look at specific operational capabilities and say what sites meet those capabilities? How did the assessment, how was that formed?
Our input is early in that process in the sense of we are providing the input into MDA, who then collocates or takes all of those inputs and puts them together into a recommendation that they will ultimately give to OSD through Dr. Griffin's office.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego. I'm sorry, Mr. Carvajal. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here today. In California and the Central Coast, we now experience a year-round fire season. It's no longer for a smaller period of time. And throughout California, and again in my district specifically, every time we experience one of these major events, we depend on the Defense Department, to be specific, the California National Guard. We recently were successful in helping them get more equipped with Black Hawk helicopters. But as we rely on the California National Guard, one thing has become evident. In order for us to use some equipment, they have now identified a challenge. Governors have requested the use of unmanned systems for emergency, disasters, search and rescue, and defense support to federal and other civil authorities like the Coast Guard. However, unlike all other assets in the National Guard inventory, there is a restriction on their use, requiring under DoD policy that the Secretary of Defense himself must sign off on each individual use, a far too long of a process that is potentially life-threatening for our communities. NORTHCOM is a part of that domestic use chain, and we understand you have worked with incident commanders in California several times to employ them when approved. General O'Shaughnessy, do you see any reason to continue prohibiting governors' immediate access to unmanned systems to help protect our citizens during emergencies? And two, how can we help expedite this process to ensure timely response to disasters?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting the great work that the Guard is doing in support of those wildfires. In fact, we work closely with Dave Baldwin, your tag, General Baldwin, and in fact, I've ridden on those very helicopters that you mentioned in looking at some of the fires that were happening in California earlier this year. One of the things I will say is the UASs that you mentioned are a high-demand, low-density asset. They are globally, all of our my sister combatant commanders do not have the ISR that they require. And as such, it's been trying to look at those assets on the global front to see where is it needed. And it's not just the asset themselves, but it's also the work that has to be done on the back end. We call it the PED. You have to process the information that comes from that UAS. And so that is why we keep that at a very high level. What I will say is I pledge to continue to work with Dave Baldwin. In fact, last year there was an occurrence during a fire season when he called me directly to ask for assistance to get the clearance from the Secretary of Defense, and within hours of his call, we actually got the Secretary of Defense's approval to use that asset. And so I think the processes are in place. We can continue to expedite it, and I commit to work closely with the Guard. But I am not opposed to the system as it sits today, and the OSD and the Secretary of Defense office has been responsive to the requests that we have made in the past.
Well, that sounds great, but as long as it works as we think it does, can we put in some kind of performance that when that communication comes from various jurisdictions, there's some kind of response period so that we know within what time period we can get some kind of an answer that will take place? Because when these incidences are happening, every minute, every hour is essential and critical. And if it's going to take days, well, you might as well not have this in place, not even have that asset available. Is there any way we can look at the system, the chain of command and communication, to make sure that there's a timely decision-making point so that communities could get the help that they deserve and need?
Yes, we can't commit to what the answer would be at the end of that, but I do believe it would be prudent for us to put a timeline to make sure that we are held accountable for getting a decision, whether a decision or yes, it is available, or no, it's not available. Yes, it can be used, no, it won't. But so I work with both you, I work with General Baldwin, and work with OSD to determine what that timeline ought to look like.
Great. I would appreciate your office following up with mine. Thank you very much.
I would just quickly add that to my knowledge, when those requests are delayed, it is because there is a multiple demand signal for the high demand, low density asset. When the system is available, the decisions are made very quickly.
Well, it would be great to look at the past 20 times that's been requested to see how efficient the system is working and where we need to make improvements. So thank you very much.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Fowler, I want to commend your very strong statement on the brutal Maduro regime at the start of this hearing and the way in which Cuba and Russia have violated Venezuelan sovereignty. In simple terms, what tools do you have in the kit to prevent enhanced Russian meddling or even Chinese meddling or Cuban meddling in Venezuela as we try and shape a positive outcome?
Clearly, the reason this crisis has gone so long is responsibility squarely rests, as you pointed out, Congressman, on Cuba, Russia, and to some extent China. China has an opportunity, I think, in the international community to step up and help with this, and they haven't. In the information space, in the intelligence space, in our partner, in our security cooperation, we have the tools we need, and we're using the full range of those tools, from cyber to public messaging and information security cooperation. We're using assets diligently and quietly in a number of ways to help paint the picture of what's going on inside and outside the country, and then we're sharing that with the interagency in full cooperation in a manner that matters. The region has been exceptionally united. Last week I was in Colombia, and the Colombian Chief of Defense and myself hosted a multinational border meeting with Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and Colombia. We discussed the range of challenges that affect the region. Central to all of those was Venezuela, and to the extent to which Venezuela complicates and magnifies every single problem that affects the region, and the extent to how these external state actors are meddling in a way that's unhelpful to democracy. So those discussions lead to coordinated calls for action, and we're all united and we're all standing firmly behind diplomacy and the need for this democratic process to work, and it will.
President Trump suggested a complete embargo of Cuba if Cuban troops don't cease their activities in support of Maduro. If you were to get such an order, do you have the assets necessary to effectuate such an embargo?
Again, back to Cuba's centrality in all things bad in this hemisphere, including how they're just simply completely protecting Maduro, all the inner circle, Praetorian Guard around Maduro, the intelligence service all infiltrated. And so the putting pressure on Cuba is a good thing, maximum pressure, a good thing. We're aware of the embargo, those orders, and we're carefully looking at plans and what it would take to do that. And I'm not prepared to discuss in an open setting what it would take.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Looking more broadly to Chinese investment in the Southcom AOR, how should Congress think about or be concerned with Chinese investment in and around the Panama Canal?
Looking around the world, we have to think globally about China. Certainly the South China Sea and Indo-PACOM area are a central piece of this, but they're a global power and they're acting globally. Their investments are global. The number of agreements that China's signed with the government of Panama, the extent to which they've locked up contracts for infrastructure, for IT, for port facilities is an area of concern. Panama still wants to partner with us, and we still share much more in common than they do with China, but they've turned to an economic partner of necessity, vice choice. And so we have to look at that more broadly, and our strategy in the Department of Defense as part of the whole government strategy is looking at those high leverage points around the world where we need to ensure the access and influence that the United States needs as a global leader.
Sure. Quickly, Assistant Secretary Rapuano, first of all, I want to thank you for your help with getting the Cyberspace Solarium Commission off the ground. I know it's been a bureaucratic struggle, but I think we're on a good path, and I want to thank you for your participation in that. You know, we've talked a lot about the future of 5G and some of the decisions our allies are making in terms of excluding Huawei and ZTE from their network, debating that, but it seems like we still have a little bit more work to do here at home. Could you just talk briefly about your concern, if any, about Huawei's activity in the United States in general, particularly in rural networks where we don't really have good visibility?
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for the role that you played with the Solarium Commission, and it's been very productive thus far, and look forward to it. With regard to 5G, obviously we have very significant concerns. We have concerns about Huawei. We have concerns about allies and partners in particular in terms of systems that may be allowing Chinese access and the accessibility of information that we are sharing with partners and allies. So that is an ongoing effort, engaging with them to give them a better appreciation for what the risk and the threat is.
And if I could follow, the General's time expired, we are going to do a couple things which are on this point within the bill. One is to try to take further steps to make sure that we cut off Huawei and ZTE from participating in having any part of our 5G going forward. But one critical part of that is to develop the domestic capability, because one of our problems is we don't have any domestic capability, and I forget the technological term, but the stuff that makes it go from the device out into the internet, we don't build that. There's a couple European companies, Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung. We are trying to develop a domestic capability, which DoD is, they're buying their own 5G piece of it, could help with. So that's something we're going to be really interested in, blocking Huawei and ZTE, but also making sure that we have a domestic capability, so we have that alternative, because regrettably, those other three that I mentioned aren't necessarily providing what we need. So we look forward to working with you, and I know, Congressman Gallagher, you have a big interest in this, so we'll certainly loop you in and work on that as well. With that, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses this morning. General O'Shaughnessy, the President's budget is proposing reallocating $1 billion in funding for military construction, including funds intended to repair hurricane-damaged installations along the East Coast for construction of a border wall. During the recess, I toured 5 of our bases, one of which was Camp Lejeune, that is filled with buildings that are tarped. And I remember them saying they had about $3 billion worth of damage there. In your estimation, what poses a greater security challenge to our homeland? Asylum seekers and economic migrants on foot, or ill-equipped Marines and soldiers living and training in unsafe buildings?
Yeah, ma'am, the individual services are the ones who, in this case, the Commandant of the Marine Corps is the one who is actually working the recovery efforts for Camp Lejeune. It doesn't fall under the NORTHCOM responsibility.
Okay. Then Secretary Rapuano, there's been an analysis from the Brookings Institute that a strategy centered around capturing high-value targets in counter-narcotics operations intensifies violence by fomenting turf wars, which lead to corruption of law enforcement officers. What strategies is the U.S. engaged in counter-narcotics operations employing in order to ensure that they do not perpetuate corruption and further destabilize the region?
So I'll turn to Secretary Wilberger to address that issue.
Hi, thank you, ma'am. I don't directly have responsibility for counter-narcotics policy, but I do have responsibility, obviously, for the region. From the Department of Defense's perspective, both counter-narcotics activities as well as counter-trafficking activities is a major line of effort for the department. We do this in support of local law enforcement as well as our interagency partners, the Coast Guard in particular, but a part and parcel of everything we do as a department in the region is, again, developing the capabilities and the capacity of these local governments to defend themselves against their external as well as internal threats. Earlier this morning, the chairman brought up Plan Columbia. I just want to highlight that the success of Plan Columbia over a couple decades is because it had bipartisan support from Congress for decades. The kind of sustained partner capacity programs we need to be successful across the host of threats in the region, not just counter-narcotics or counter-trafficking or the drug cartels, really takes sort of our sustained commitment to these partners. And so, you know, the strategy is a whole of government one in terms of addressing the challenges of the region, but with respect to our particular capabilities in the department, it's really ensuring that our partners have resources and capabilities to secure themselves internally.
So who should I talk to specifically within your department on this issue then?
Assistant Secretary Owen West has responsibility for our counter-narcotics programs.
All right, thank you.
I just would note that no funding has been taken from the 284 counter-drug programs for barrier construction, either to NORTHCOM or Southern
No, but
Command.
I was asking a different question. Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Wheelbarger, in your written statement, you described the need to address great power competition with China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere as they seek to expand their political, economic, and military influence throughout Latin America. The the initiatives by China are pretty widespread around the world. According to Pew polls in 2016, 66% of Latin America held favorable views of the United States, but by 2017, the favorability had dropped by 19 points. Given this considerable and rapid decline, are we still able to appeal to militaries in the region as a source of training, equipment, and leadership? Are we still well positioned on the field that you mentioned?
Yes, thank you. Global competition with China is, as the National Defense Strategy indicated, one of our key priorities as a department. We stress to our partners, as Admiral Fowler mentioned earlier, it's not just what equipment you can get or what training you can get, but actually how much you can trust the partner that you are partnering with. And the United States continues to be well positioned throughout the region to be the security partner of choice. I think from the day-to-day activities with throughout the ranks of our government, whether it be our training in the United States or in the region, we continue to be well positioned to compete and grow in our competition in the region. And I would defer to Admiral Fowler if you have any other thoughts.
Thanks for the question. From the mill-to-mill perspective in my travels, and I've met with almost every single chief of defense or minister of defense, and we try to get out beyond that when my wife goes with me. The people still want to and value that relationship with the United States above all. So whatever the polls say, ma'am, what I'm seeing in person and what my team is seeing is an affinity to work with us and trust us.
I know my time's expired, but while you may dismiss the polls based on your personal interactions with people, I think it's very important to recognize that there has been slippage, and what are we going to do to raise it? Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here today, and it's good to see General O'Shaughnessy again. Used to serve with him a few years ago. My first question is to Admiral Fowler. You know, Venezuela used to be the richest, wealthiest country in South America and in the region. Both the dictatorship and the socialist policies have broke it. Can you just give us your feedback on just how bad it is for the average Venezuelan?
Shortly after I assumed command, I had the opportunity to go out on the United States naval ship Comfort, which we had deployed to the region to provide comfort, medical support, life-saving stability to the entire region that was impacted by this crisis. And I got to see some small children, 8-year-old, 9-year-old kids. The average Venezuelans lost 20 pounds in the last year. These kids were emaciated. This is the first time they'd received any medical treatment in their lives. I don't think they knew who I was or what I was about. Their mother certainly did. And the look in her eye and the conditions that she represented impacts the entire region. Over 3 million people have been migrated out of Venezuela. It's on track to be worse than the Syria migration crisis by the end of this year. And that is affecting all aspects of life. 90% of the people are malnutritioned and starving. Most of the countries without power, we see that daily. And it's a dictatorship and brutal in all ways.
The governance has devastated its own people, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, sir.
On a different tact, it seems to me that Colombia and Chile has been sort of the pillars of our engagement in South America, or at least our closest relationships. Do I have that characterized right?
Colombia is an example when we have a long view. We stick to a plan over 20 years, as Secretary Wilberger stated, with people committed to their own democracy, their own security, where we can have impacts. Colombia this year is on track to train over 1,000 security personnel in Central America. Those security personnel are going to contribute to the security of their countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and beyond, and the United States. They're a capable and willing partner. Chile stepped up and has stepped up consistently. They have participated in some of our international exercises at a leadership level, and they remain a very capable and committed partner.
I sense from what I'm hearing from Brazil that there's a desire to draw closer with us, which is, I think, good news. Could you just give us your views or your perspective on the potential of what we can do with the stronger ties with Brazil.
Brazil's a resource-rich country that has the same values of us, the second largest democracy in the hemisphere. They are all in. We've been down to Brazil. They've been to see us. We're integrating our staffs. We're sharing information. They're looking for ways to strengthen intelligence sharing, exercises, education. Part of our security assistance program is so important is this international military education and training IMET that is referred to. It's on State Department funded in foreign assistance. It's foundation. We build lifelong friends. I'm looking to double that this year, but I will need the support of Congress to raise that level of assistance. And Brazil's all in. They want to double the number of people they send to our schools.
Thank you. General Shaughnessy, you have such an important mission. So does STRATCOM, so does the future of Space Command. And it seems like there's some overlapping potential there or mission areas. How do you deconflict? What are some of the challenges there? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it may be looked at as a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And we're clearly, as STRATCOM has morphed over several years, if you look at Cyber Command coming out, now we'll look at Space Command, and that has given us an opportunity to really look at all of the mission sets and try to determine what's the best organizational construct there. What I will say and report, without a doubt, it is a collaborative perspective that we're taking. And if you look at all of the players, whether it be General Hyten, whether it'll be at least under Air Force Space Command is being worked by Jay Raymond, how do we best do this? That's the only question that's being asked. I think we'll be able to work our way through this, but in the end, I think we'll end up being stronger than we are today.
Turn my mic back on. Are we where we need to be when it comes to speediness of response? NORTHCOM detects threats, then STRATCOM would have to respond. Do we have that as seamless as possible?
I would say we do, and then actually it's NORTHCOM responds as well as the operational. We're actually the ones who do the ballistic missile defense, STRATCOM, and we're tied on the same conferences and literally seconds, not minutes in the way we respond together.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Hill.
Thank you. Thank you all for your service. General O'Shaughnessy, you spend a great deal of time talking about Russian threats, including their investments in long-range, low-radar, cross-section cruise missiles that can be fired from aircraft or subs against targets within the United States, and in particular about advanced long-range cruise missiles capable of flying through the northern approaches. Can you talk about the potential capability of the F-35 in missile defense?
Certainly, and as we look at these threats that you mentioned, one of the reasons that we are most concerned about it is we see not only a capability and a capacity, we see a doctrine where their very strategy as they articulate it is to take that attacks on our infrastructure. And then we look at the patterns of behavior that they do. For example, they're fly the missions that are clearly flying and practice attacks against North America. And so to that end, we want to make sure we have the most advanced capability that we can possibly have. F-35 has proven itself. In fact, we just heard it in the news. It just dropped in combat in the latest within the last 24 or 48 hours. But it's also more importantly, it's the ability for it to fuse all of the capability together that becomes critically important, because it's not just the end game is how you get after the cruise missiles. It's the sensors that have to all fuse together for that to work, and whether it be from a red flag scenarios that we see, whether we show the exercise that we do, we see the F-35's real capability and capacity is its ability to essentially be the quarterback, if you will, to bring all that together. So we see it as vital going forward.
So you need them.
We need them, and as many as we can procure.
Great. Okay, and then along the same lines, what's your biggest challenge when dealing with Russian military aircraft in the U.S. and Canadian air defense identification zones?
Our biggest challenge we have right now is domain awareness. Many of our systems were designed in the Cold War era, and as the Russians have advanced their capability, we need to stay ahead of that and advance our capability and be able to understand what is happening in the Arctic, as an example, where we are currently challenged and need to advance our capabilities.
So I think you mentioned there's been an increase in these interactions in the last few years. Is that correct?
It's increased in the number, but really they've been up and down as they've gone through a modernization with their bombers. But more importantly, it's the complexity of the events that we're seeing. Very complex, very much more integrated with multiple platforms that has us concerned.
Thank you. Are there resources that you need that you're not currently receiving to execute this part of the Homeland Defense strategy?
As always, much like my partner here in Southcom, we're always looking to make sure that we have the adequate resources to defend our nation. We do, but I will say that going forward, as this becomes more and more advanced weaponry, we want to make sure that we maintain the ability to stay ahead of those threats is probably our most pressing concern.
So as we move to an all fifth-generation fleet, is it fair to say that F-35 would be used for these missions as well?
Yes.
Okay. Admiral Fowler, in your statement, you mentioned a Russian spy ship with the capability to map undersea cables. Are you able to tell us in this setting what's being done to harden and protect the fiber optic systems that connect our world?
I can speak broadly about Russia in the region. The specifics would not be able to go into in this setting, but around the world, Russia is advancing their interests in ways that are harmful, and we see this around the world, and we see it in Latin America and the Caribbean as well.
So I guess that kind of leads to a simple summary from you all. Would you say, just in terms of North and South America, who is our most dangerous and imminent threat?
I would say in the long term, it's China, without a doubt, as a nation. I think as we look at the threat that China presents us. But in the short term, we have significant concerns about the Russian capability and their patterns of behavior and what they've shown to be an intent.
China, without a doubt, and our best defense is to ensure that our defense remains strong, that our people are ready, that we invest in it appropriately, and we don't overlook the home game here in this hemisphere, with security cooperation being key. It's a small dollar value with a high return on investment.
And Ms. Wilbarger, would you agree? And Mr. Rapuano?
Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes describe it as, I think, China is our chronic threat, and in some ways Russia is our acute threat right now, given their misbehavior around the world, but we have to make sure we address them equally, as well as ensure stability around the world so we don't get distracted as we maintain that long-term focus.
I also strongly agree, and just on the partnerships and alliances, they're tremendous force multipliers for us, and the United States is unique in our history and ability to leverage those partnerships.
Thank you all. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, if the DoD was prohibited from contracting with any persons that had business operations with an authority of Venezuela that is not recognized as the legitimate government of Venezuela by the government of the United States, which capabilities would you expect could be impaired from our standpoint?
More broadly, I think anything we can do to impact and pressure Venezuela and continue this necessary transition democracy, we should be doing, and I know we're looking at that across the full range. My suspicion is we haven't done it yet. We just haven't thought of it because the full court press from our leadership on. To the specifics of your question, I'm not aware or understanding of any impacts on those, but we'd have to look at them case by case.
Well, thank you for that response, and if you could take that for the record and provide responses, because I believe my colleague Mr. Waltz and I are going to introduce an amendment to the NDAA to assist you in achieving that pressure, but in doing so, we don't want to have the inadvertent effect of hamstringing DoD. I don't expect that it would do that. Your clarification that you can't think of a circumstance where it would is similarly helpful. I want to now ask about how the United States is interacting with and engaging in the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. If the United States were to have uniformed military in Venezuela engaging in operations, have we modeled out or planned or conducted analysis regarding how some of the other ALBA nations would react to such an action?
Well, first, looking at the range of things we're thinking about, discussing with our partners, our allies, and within the interagency, we're looking at ways to be helpful to the inevitable rise of legitimate Guaido government, and then how do we set the table afterwards to ensure that those professional military forces get the training, the assistance they need. This will be a regionally led issue. The countries in the region that aren't democracies, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Cuba, and the external actors that don't believe in democracy, although they may say they do, they're not going to be happy about anything we do. I mean, Russian news agencies had repeated reports of me.
Other than unhappiness, which I appreciate and understand, are there other activities that we've had to analyze or plan for? For example, if we were to put uniformed military on the ground in Caracas, do we have contingency plans for mass protests in other Latin American capitals? Because as I've analyzed how the region perceives the possibility of U.S. involvement, and I understand we've got to keep every option on the table, that U.S. involvement is very popular right now in Venezuela and with the Venezuelan diaspora, but U.S. direct involvement with uniformed military is very unpopular with every other Latin American country. If you're aware of information that is different or more up to date, I'd love to hear it. But I just wonder whether or not our military, and I know we're involved in a lot of train and equip missions with these other partner nations, if we're planning for the potential of the Venezuelan crisis erupting into a broader regional crisis, if the arrival of American troops on the ground gives Maduro the ability to externalize his conflict, to scapegoat his own failures, and then to deny the organic efforts of the Venezuelan people to fight for a brighter future.
I wouldn't want to speculate on anything that Maduro's thinking. I'm not sure he does. But the details of the different course of action, things we're looking at, I would take in a closed session. Broadly, we're looking at, as I've said, the leadership's been clear. Our job is to be ready, and we're on the balls of our feet.
And I have no doubt, as the congressman for the 7th Special Forces Group, that we are ready, and we could take the fight to the enemy, and we can win it. I just want to make sure that if we're going to have that fight, and if it becomes necessary, that we have really thought out all the options when, in my experience, there is a good amount of latent resentment in some pockets of Latin America that date back to prior administrations and their involvement in the continent. And so I certainly am proud of that state of readiness, and I would similarly add that over the last decade or so, the great work at Southcom has greatly enhanced the capabilities of our partner nations. The Colombians, the Peruvians, they are no joke. They can bring the fight, and I think that that is a consequence of the great work that has been done at Southcom, and I hope that, you know, as circumstances continue to change in Venezuela, that we leverage the great work that we've done so that we have, as you described, a regional approach and not a unilateral approach by the United States.
I'd like to commend the 7th Special Forces Group and our teammates in your district. They're ready to go, and they have a focus on the region, and we actually need more of their presence. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you all for everything you do to keep us safe. A lot of American lives are entrusted in your care. I want to actually pick up where Mr. Gates left off and ask a similar question. This kind of harkens back to the Iraq experience. You say you have contingency plans if we were to do something in Venezuela. Do we have any plans for what happens on the day after? Not just in other countries, but in Venezuela itself. We've obviously been through the experience of having great invasion plans and no plans for what to do next in recent conflicts.
The complexity of the situation, the magnitude of the misery is going to require every element of international unity that currently exists to focus on a recovery of the economic infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, port facilities, electrical infrastructure that Maduro's ruined. There are ongoing efforts to look at all aspects of this. At my headquarters, we call it Day Now, because there is going to be a day when the legitimate government takes over, and it's going to come when we least expect it, and it could be right now. So we're calling it Day Now planning.
And do those plans exist in the contingency of U.S. military intervention as well, Admiral?
Our ability to be ready for anything that the President's been clear might be on the table is things we're looking at. We're on the balls of our feet. The details of what those plans look like, I would take in closed session.
Okay. I'd like to shift to Mr. Gallagher's question about Panama. And I understand you answered it briefly, but just tell me in general here, you've all stated the influence of China is the greatest long-term threat to the security and safety of the United States. I would agree with you. What's the worst-case scenario with the Chinese presence in Panama?
I'd like to start by pointing out what Panama is doing for us. So the canal remains open and free, and the Canal Authority remains independent and operational. Panama has stepped up their game in the drug interdiction through our security cooperation.
Admiral, with all due respect, I'm asking about the worst case, not the best.
The worst case is that I can't answer that question in that way a year, 2 years, 5, or a generation from now, because Panama Canal, both the zone and the ends of the canal are controlled by Chinese, and they actually influence the Panama in a way that's counter to any international interest.
So since we're heading in that direction, maybe quickly, maybe slowly, what can we do to stop it? What should we be doing to turn Chinese influence away? Because right now it just seems to be increasing.
The military dimension that has to stay strong. Our partnerships must be consistent. We must be responsive in our security cooperation. Some of the tools that Congress has given us are good, but they're not responsive enough. The current way that we've implemented our 333 authorities are too slow. A lot of that is on the department to look itself in the mirror and figure out how to speed it up. Some of this could be better if we had 2-year money and combatant commanders had some additional authority to deliver on small things that can help both our partners and return on investment for the security of the United States.
Admiral, in general, do you think we are doing enough as the United States of America to deter the Russian and Chinese influence in our hemisphere?
I'd say that we are doing everything we can, and that will never be enough or fast enough. So we have to act with the speed of urgency.
Well, I mean, frankly, if their presence in the region were decreasing, I would say it's probably enough. I mean, it's headed in the right direction, but it doesn't seem to be headed in that direction. General, do you have any comment on this? Do you think we're doing enough to deter Russian and Chinese influence in our hemisphere?
Well, I would agree with Admiral Fowler in that we do need to continue to engage here. I'll just use our own within NORTHCOM AOR. Look at the Bahamas. Is a nation 50 miles off the coast of Florida, yet we're seeing Chinese influence right there. And it does not take a significant amount of dollars, frankly, for a very positive effect. And so the more that we can look at it within this hemisphere and focus our efforts not just in this particular area, we go with China, the Asia-Pacific region, but in the Western Hemisphere as well, I think we'll see the fruits of that pay off fairly quickly.
Well, I hope you'll be a partner with us with the development of the NDAA to help in that mission. Ms. Wheelbarger, we don't have much time left, but I just wanted to ask you, do you think Plan Colombia should be a model? Should Plan Colombia be a model that we duplicate elsewhere?
I think it's dangerous to always think about duplicating programs in countries or locations that are not exactly the same. But I will say, as a model of a whole-of-government approach and inter-branch approach to a particular problem set, it is a model. And I've used it as one of the examples I give of our security cooperation truly working, because it was long-term, it was sustained, it had bipartisan support, and it didn't just focus on tactics and operations. It focused on true defense institution building, and that is the sort of thing we need to be doing around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Walton. I would say, when we look back to the Central American countries where most of the migrants are coming from, whether Plan Colombia is the exact model or not, but some sort of comprehensive plan in that region is probably the best thing we could do to deal with the migrant crisis that we have. Before I call on Mr. Waltz, I want to welcome him to the adults table. For those of you who don't know, we had to reconfigure the room here. He used to be all by himself down there in front, right next to the witnesses, and now he has joined the rest of us. So welcome, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I've spent a little bit of time on forward outposts, and I like to consider it the forward combat post up there. But thank you for that, and thank you all for coming today. And just to add to my colleague Seth Moulton's comment there, I do think Plan Colombia as a Green Beret, I'm a little bit invested in that one as the tip of the spear on Plan Colombia. I do think it's a model for advise and assist and whole of government operations. Admiral, thank you for coming by yesterday. As a number of my colleagues have stated, I think I had a back and forth with my good friend Tucker Carlson of Fox News on why should the American people care, really, of what's going on down in Venezuela. And I reminded him that the migration problem, the refugee problem from Venezuela is approaching the levels that we saw in Syria, and that we're approaching 3 to 5 million refugees by the end of 2019, destabilizing the area. I think it's important for us to really take that message out on what this can do, what the Cubans, Russians, and Chinese are doing, not only in Venezuela, but doing it in Nicaragua as well, where we're also seeing a refugee flow. So given that dynamic, do you think it's a time, Admiral Fowler, for a coalition, humanitarian, forcible if necessary intervention? Do you think from a logistics and military standpoint that the Colombians, the Brazilians, possibly the French and Dutch are ready with U.S. leadership to have that intervention? And do you think it would do more harm than good? I mean, do you think it would do more good than harm?
I'd start with the level above that, Congressman, where it's time for a plan for the hemisphere. We talked about Plan Colombia. We need a plan for this hemisphere, and an initiative that recognizes the importance of this hemisphere with all the various security dimensions that have been discussed today, including the impact that this Venezuela crisis particularly has on all of us, this mass migration. To the point of the partner unity, extremely important that the partners are unified. Partners and the allies, the Dutch, the French, the UK, the Canadians, to the extent that the diplomatic solution needs that kind of bulk that militaries can bring to humanitarian intervention. I know in the U.S. we're prepared to support. So diplomatic-led, and if
I completely agree with you. We need a broader plan, Latin America, but in the immediate term, while we're at an inflection, a crisis point in Venezuela, do you think that intervening with a humanitarian, coalition-led, is a viable option at this point? Would you recommend it?
There's a need for humanitarian assistance. It ought to have an international and a USAID or an Organization of American States face. And if asked, militaries would be, our military and partners, I think, willing and ready to help support the flow. We've seen that already with the staging in Colombia and Brazil.
Do you assess that the Cuban security forces, which I've seen estimates ranging from 3,000 upwards of 20,000, Cuban security forces on the ground protecting Maduro, do you think they would oppose militarily a coalition intervention, particularly with Colombian and Brazilian involvement?
I wouldn't want to speculate what the Cubans would or wouldn't do. I think they're as likely as unpredictable as the Russians. There would have to be some level of cooperation and invitation from the legitimate Guaido government to make this work.
Do you think it would be, I completely agree, do you think it would be helpful if Guaido offered amnesty and more overtly offered amnesty?
Well,
in terms of peeling away Maduro-loyal military officers?
The amnesty offer's open, and as I understand, they're moving forward towards enacting that in legislation. That would be very helpful if the National Assembly passed that as part of the package. But I think there's plenty of teeth to the amnesty. And again, the message I'd have to the military is believe in us. The world's united. There'll be amnesty. There'll be a place in our schools. There'll be a place to partner with us when there's a legitimate democracy.
What do you assess as the Russian presence on the ground in terms of either military, Wagner Group, surrogates, and what's their current mission and guidance and role?
We saw recently additional flights in, 100 or so, technical special forces, other advisors. There are other Russians present. I wouldn't want to discuss in an open hearing what our estimate of their presence are, but it's significant, and it's contributing to the devastation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Chairman. And good morning. Thank you all so much for your testimony this morning. And gentlemen, thank you especially for your service. Very grateful for it. Mr. Rapuano, the fiscal year 16 NDAA had a provision in it entitled Section 1059, Department of Defense Authority to provide assistance to secure the southern land border of the United States. In communications with Congress, the Department of Defense has cited this as one of their authorities for deploying service members to the southern border, including my community, El Paso, Texas. This authority requires a DoD report every 3 months. And yet, as we approach 6 months of active duty support at the southern border, this committee has not received a single one of these reports. The first report would have been due the first week of February. Why hasn't the department adhered to the law that they are citing and submitted the required report?
Congresswoman, I am familiar with 1059. I will get more familiar with the reporting requirement. I'll follow up on that and ensure that we follow up if we are not complying with our obligations.
Great. And would you be able to have a timeline for when this committee and myself in particular would receive a copy of this report?
As fast as I can help make it happen.
Okay, thank you. I'd appreciate that. Admiral, I so appreciated your perspective on having a plan for the hemisphere. As I mentioned, I'm from El Paso. I represent El Paso, and we have seen a significant influx of essentially asylum seekers arriving at our front doorstep. And I agree with the chairman when he says that really the best way to address what is a significant humanitarian challenge is to address what's happening in the Northern Triangle. I myself have called for hemispheric collaboration and cooperation. This is a shared responsibility and duty. So with that in mind, and because I so appreciated that comment you made, can you speak to the efforts Southcom is engaged in the critical Northern Triangle region to address the root causes of these immigration flows? And do you think you can positively impact this humanitarian challenge that we're facing?
We're working with our partners in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Belize, not traditionally considered part of the Northern Triangle, but part of that region, to work on professional forces. Professional forces have legitimacy with their people. We have a human rights program that is now in its 20th year. We talk about human rights at every venue. We hold training, and I found them very receptive, but this is a long process, and there's a history to everything. We also have non-commissioned officer NCO training and development. The backbone of our forces are our enlisted, and to the extent that we can grow that and build that in our partners is very important. And they're in from our perspective. They're all in. But again, it's something they have to really work on with a longer view. Another aspect of this is just general military, professional military education training. The Western Hemisphere Institute for Security at Fort Benning. We put upwards of about 2,000 enlisted officers through that school year, range of courses that deal at the heart in sharing common doctrine, training, and tactics with our partners that helps them go back and be more interoperable with us on drug enforcement missions, security, stability type missions. At the institution level, the Perry Center here in Washington, D.C. is a place where they teach the classes in Spanish. It's over at in adjunct with the National Defense University. And we bring through, at the institutional level, we're trying to teach our partners the best practices in budgeting and programming and planning so that the important security dollars that they have or that we contribute can be used effectively and appropriately. All these tools, we're working each and every day. That it's not very high dollar, but it has high impact. And you have to, we can measure and see that impact over time. It is working.
And so, Admiral, I take it that you believe that the aid that we provide to the Northern Triangle is crucial to that success.
The mill-to-mill security cooperation that we're working is showing demonstrated results that are improving the security of the homeland of the United States. Can our partners do more? They can. I've spoken to all their chiefs of defense in recent weeks and their ministers. They're committed to do more, and next week we'll host a security conference to ask them to do more, and we'll work towards that goal.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doing a little bit of research, Nicolas Maduro is quite clearly a socialist, but he was elected to the National Assembly as far back as the year 2000, and then was elected again with Chavez in 2012, 2013, this time as vice president. And finally, in 2013, was elected president with 50.6% of the vote, more or less. Of course, there's always a debate about legitimacy of elections that we're familiar with. When we look at Juan Guaido, he helped found the Social Democratic Popular Will Party. The research suggests that that is also a socialist organization. Certainly it's a supporter of the Socialist International entity. He was elected in 2015 to the National Assembly with 26% of the vote. And the National Assembly later promoted him to the status that he has now. Given that it appears that the fight is between two different sets of socialists, both of whom, at least in the original day in which they got into politics, were elected, is there anything that suggests to you, and feel free, any of you that wish to answer, is there anything that suggests to any of you that Guaido, if he does assume power in Venezuela, will not also turn out to be a dictator, much like Maduro ended up being?
I'll go ahead and take that. I think the important thing to recognize, too, in the recent history of when you talk about these are both elected officials, is the clear indications of illegitimacy of the last election, and the international community recognizing that there weren't just questions about the election, but that it was pretty clear that Maduro secured himself a continued position. And what's unique now in this particular time versus previous periods of protest within Venezuela, where Maduro clearly didn't have the support of his people, is now we do actually have a recognized alternative opposition that can replace him. And so, whereas in the future, you don't ever know what in the future can bring, what we do know is right now we are living under a regional disaster caused by one man's desire to continue to rule that population illegitimately. And as Admiral Fowler has described in great detail, the level of harm he has brought to his own citizenry is not something that we could sit back and just ignore. And so the fact that we do have an opposition leader who's now we recognize as the legitimate interim president, that the international community and the people in Venezuela can rally behind is a significant difference from the past few years.
Well, we know that Maduro has become a dictator, but we also know that it's his economic policies founded in socialism that have wreaked havoc with that economy, as socialism has done with so many economies around the world at various periods of time. Do you know anything about Guaido that would suggest that he ultimately would not become dictatorial too, which is the essence of socialism, where the government is dictating to the populace what they can and cannot do in an economic ballpark? Anything about Guaido that would suggest that he ultimately would not follow that same dictatorial path?
I don't think we should assume that he would follow a dictator path. So I think the evidence that we have of the hope in him is the communications and the relationship we already have between him, his people, and most directly our Department of State.
All right. And again, this is a different question. Any of y'all want to chime in, please do so. There have been different suggestions that China, Russia, and Cuba have been involved economically, perhaps even militarily, in trying to prop up the Maduro regime. Is there somewhere that y'all can try to quantify how much each of these three nations are propping up Maduro?
I'll take that. The estimates of Cuban military strength range between 2,000 and 20,000. Those are accurate. All the guards that surround Maduro are all Cuban.
That's a pretty big gap, 2,000 to 20,000.
Big gap.
All right. I'm sorry. Keep going.
The Russian strength is significant. Recently saw 100 personnel fly in, special forces. They're involved in cyber. They're involved in air defense. They're involved in technical training and aspect. They recently commissioned a helicopter maintenance facility. Most of the gear, the kit that the Venezuelan military uses, a lot of it is Russian. And China's in there a way that goes far beyond soft power, as I mentioned in my opening statement, in the information space as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Ms. Lauria.
So, Admiral Fowler, on Sunday of this week, you relieved Admiral Ring as the commander of the Joint Task Force overseeing the prison at Guantanamo Bay. This happened a day after the New York Times published a story where he was critical of the long-term plans for the prison. Was his firing a result of this criticism?
The firing, the relief for cause of Admiral Ring was in no way related to any media reporting. Okay. It was a result of loss of confidence in an investigation that had completed long before any of
Did anyone outside of Southern Command direct or encourage you to fire Admiral Ring?
No, that decision was mine.
Okay, so for the record, you're saying his firing was unrelated to anything reported in the New York Times?
Correct.
Switching subjects, what percentage of your 2019 request for forces specifically for surface combatants was met?
We received no Navy ships in our 2019 request. After the request, we did receive some fills for exercises, and the Navy came through with littoral combat ship.
So to move on the impact of that, you previously said today that only 6% of the drug shipments that are known are actually interdicted. And is I can only assume that this low level is a direct result of the fact that you don't have any specifically Navy assets to help intercept those. And in your comments, you also said all elements of the U.S. government are laser focused on this problem of, stopping drugs flowing into our country. But would you agree that we are not allocating an appropriate amount of naval assets to work in conjunction with the U.S. Coast Guard, potentially leadettes on Navy platforms in order to help this problem?
The area is the size of the United States, as you know, and we have on any given day 6 to 10 Coast Guard cutters, and now we do have a Navy PC and a USNS fast transport ship, so not adequate enough forces.
So you mentioned the EPF, the fast transport ship. Do you find that an effective platform in conjunction with Coast Guard leadettes to be able to help for a much lower cost than, say, a DDG or a cruiser operating in the area to be able to get after this problem?
Congresswoman, the finishing part of that discussion on the Navy's readiness, which I have knowledge of, is certainly impacted here too. So when we look globally, there's just not enough naval assets. The EPF is a good platform. There needs to be some fixes made, a military sea lift command and the Navy to a couple of the systems that assist in seakeeping and boat launching. We get past those shortfalls. That platform would be a good platform for a detection and monitoring drug interdiction operation.
Thank you. And a final topic, we've talked a lot about Chinese investment in the Panama Canal region and within South America. And some in the current administration have invoked the Monroe Doctrine when speaking of Latin America. Do you think the United States should use the concept of the Monroe Doctrine or an approach similar in Latin America regarding the increasing Chinese influence and Russian influence?
I'd leave the application of Monroe Doctrine to policy and policymakers. The committed, enduring promise of partnership is what we ought to focus on, and that's what we are focused on.
Would you see that any differently if this economic expansion and investment in port facilities and the different activities that you've described was expanded to an actual military base within South America?
If we make the right investments in time, people, location, training, education, the full range of security cooperation, I'm convinced that we'll be the partner of choice and we'll maintain those long-term relationships. It troubles me that China is on a path to have permanent bases in this hemisphere. I believe that they are, based on my own assessments of their intent and capability around the world.
So to dovetail further on the discussion about naval assets and your ability to conduct drug interdiction mission, I would only assume the fact that you had 0 assets allocated to you, intentionally, deliberately allocated to you for your mission last year. The same thing would apply that you don't feel like you have sufficient naval assets to show presence in the region or to do theater security cooperation with our allies as far as naval assets is concerned.
Congresswoman, the two go hand in hand. We've created a concept with our 4th Fleet to build a combined maritime task force with U.S. naval leadership and naval assets. We believe that'll bring more out of our partners as we work and train together, both for the drug mission and across all the range of missions that we have in this hemisphere.
But just to clarify, it's a little bit hard to do that if you don't actually have any ships assigned to the 4th Fleet.
You absolutely can't win a football game without players on the field.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our hearing. I thank you for your testimony and all the members for their questions, and we are adjourned.
How are you? Good to see you. Good to see you. Likewise. I'm good. Having fun? Absolutely.
Yeah, how you doing?
Great question. Thanks.
That got off easy.
Thank you.
Thought we were going to get the whole thing without getting more questions.
A little bit.
A little bit. Thank you. Thank you.
What's that?
It really is. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate you. My pleasure. You can see this is what every other committee that's flamethrowing each other. This is pretty. Thank you, God. Yeah, like literally, I think if you close your eyes, you couldn't tell the size, which is refreshing. Yeah, right. So there's not a long process. It's how you do administration.
Right, and it's. I think that goes to the.
You have two. Yeah. Yeah. go back in the good old days. It's fun having two special forces types in Arkansas. Anyway, yeah, that was definitely not the other way. I sat in one the other day.
That was very day-to-day consistency that they were not sharing negotiations, even though they were Republican members were because local officials actually get very criticized. Our version of Southern River, not a lot of black documents, but a lot of that is not
right. On the missile defense side, on the talking point, about 50% hit rate on GMD tests.
Yeah.
That's still valid.
Which interceptor? The older interceptor has lower confidence.
Right. Newer ones are yielded?
Yes. The latest ones have been yielded.
Upgraded?
I'm not exactly sure with California.
Okay.